So my name is Jonathan Lewis. I'm the Executive Director of Evangelization, Young Adult Ministry, and Chaplaincies in the Archdiocese of Washington in D.C., and very pleased to have this conversation hosted by the Catholic Apostolate Center, which does wonderful work nationally in evangelization and internationally based here in Washington, D.C. as well. And Lisa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I'm Lisa Anslinger. I was a parish director, pastoral associate for evangelization and catechesis in a large parish in Cincinnati, and I now travel and write and work with parish leaders throughout, and diocesan leaders throughout the United States and Canada.
Wonderful. Well, and Lisa, you want to share, I guess you can share maybe in a bit after we do maybe an opening prayer, some of your experience. Yeah. You've had a lot of intimate experience working with the growing young folks and the content at Fuller. But let's just begin in prayer together, maybe in a mindfulness of all the young people in which we're in relationship with, those who we have served in our life of ministry, or those who we are serving at this moment, and certainly those in our families and close friends who are left the church, who have left the church, or who are struggling in their life in some way. And so we just raise up in our minds and hearts today, Lord, all of those, the names of people, all the ministry which you call us, in a special way for the Holy Father in preparation for the Synod on Young People to take place in just a few short months later this year. We offer you up all of our works and ministry that you may conform it to your will as we pray together. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, again, this was sort of just the brainchild of or fruit of a conversation Lisa and I had months ago over the phone, and we're really excited to have it and to engage in some conversation. In terms of sort of our time together, we're going to have a bit of overview over the 6 core commitments. You can see on the left side of your screen, we have the wheel from Growing Young, as well as the description briefly of those 6 core commitments underneath that as well. If you would like to have some conversation during the beginning of the time, feel free to use the chat section to add some comments together. We've muted everyone just so there isn't a lot of background noise at the very beginning. And I'll sort of pose some questions to Lisa, and we'll just talk briefly about those 6 core commitments, but hopefully briefly so that we can have really more time for some live video conversation together as a group. And again, during that time, you can either use the chat section to ask questions or share comments, or to do that over video. Everyone will be unmuted at that time, just so we can all sort of ping pong our ideas together. So with that, I'm certainly the novice here, Lisa. I would love for you to sort of kick us off and share a little bit about your experience with Growing Young, maybe what it grew out of, since even if people have some familiarity with the content, maybe not as much with the process.
Right. Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's really good to be with you all, and I have to say I've been looking forward to today and have been holding this in prayer as I've been continuing to really learn and reflect about Growing Young and think about what this might mean for us as Catholic leaders. I know a few of you, but I don't know all of you. I think it might be helpful for you to know I come out of a background as a high school counselor. I was a director of guidance at a Catholic high school for 11 years, and then moved to parish leadership, and then 10 years ago made this very prayerful decision to leave full-time parish ministry and to really focus on writing and presenting and really in a lot of ways coaching parish leaders, especially around evangelization, stewardship. I've worked a lot with the Gallup engagement and strengths processes, and all of that really has helped me to have a real appreciation of the need to have the opportunity for people to have really meaningful relationships within their faith community. A friend of mine last fall shared the link to an intro video around Growing Young with me and said, "This has got you all over it. You need to see this." And while I was watching the video, I ordered the book. And when the book came and I started plowing into it, I immediately wanted to get further in touch with the research and to think about what this might help us to think about as Catholic leaders. I was so thrilled when I found that there were Catholic parishes that were part of the study. I love that one of the early case studies that's reported in the book is St. John the Evangelist in Indianapolis, and I know many of us know that parish through our experience at NCYC, and we can picture the building in our minds as we're reading the story there. But I think even in just reading that example of a parish that is really effectively engaging young people, we see, evidence of things that we've experienced with other parishes, in so many different ways in the course of our collective ministry. One of the things that's cited early in the book is that as the folks at Fuller were synthesizing what they were learning, they decided that they needed a pastor board who would help them to really kind of interpret all of the data that they were acquiring. And one of the people on that board was Father Len Wenke, who was at one time the executive director of the NFCYM, but he also is a priest of the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. And so I emailed Len and said, do you happen to know if the folks at Fuller are doing any training? And within a half an hour, I had an email from Jake Mulder, who's one of the co-authors of Growing Young and is helping to coordinate all of their training. So that's a bit of background as to how I ended up getting here today. I began training with them in October. Did 2 days of training in October and just completed 3 days last week. And so now I'm finished with the training. I think it's helpful for you to know that these folks, first of all, Growing Young was a grant-funded project. And I think because of that, they feel a different sort of sense of freedom in sharing the information. And really just their hope is to get this information in the hands of as many congregational leaders as they can. Multi-denominations are present in their trainings, and they're very, very respectful of Catholics. They're very hopeful that we'll find their research useful in all of the ways that we might be able to. But the processes that they've developed really are very simple, and they're things that we can be exploring in all of the ways that we might. What they're doing right now is they're gathering congregational teams in Pasadena at Fuller. They're essentially walking people through the 6 core commitments. So there's an opening session that describes all of the research, and then they literally walk people through the 6 core commitments over the course of 2 days. I've told a number of people that I've talked with, the process that they've developed, I think, is probably what any of us would do if we were going to develop a process around this. Here's what the study leads us to think about. Now, what does that look like in your own situation? And I think it's really helpful to notice on that image that you have on the screen there, that kind of gray circle around the circle that says context. That really is one of the most important pieces, because each of us in our own context is going to take the principles that they've identified, and we're going to use those in different ways depending on our situation. And I think that's really helpful. There is no one size fits all, and I find that so encouraging in this. Because I think we've all experienced the program approach that says if you just do this, everything's going to be fine, and we all know that it doesn't ever work out that way. I think this invites us to ask some really critical questions. The other thing that I think is really important to note at the beginning here is that one of the things that the folks at Fuller are very clear about, and becoming more so as they work with parish teams, is that really bottom line, this is about a culture change. This is if people might come into it through a desire to evangelize young people, for the sake of this study, they're looking at ages 15 to 30. Now, we know that's a huge, wide range in terms of age and in terms of life experience and in terms of the things that are going on in people's lives during those years. But it's also very reflective then of that recognition that what happens before and what happens after that age range is also going to be impacted. And no surprise, one of the primary learnings from the study was that, you know, when you really engage young people, the whole parish is going to be transformed. And that's both encouraging and challenging in the ways that we might expect. I think it's really helpful just to remind us that, you know, what happened was the initial group that was provided a web survey was identified through congregational leaders. And so Bob McCarty, Michael Tyson, Amy McEntee, they were invited to nominate parishes that they were aware of all different sizes and shapes and demographics, that were in one way or another effectively engaging young people. Out of that initial group of 250 plus congregations that completed an online survey, 41 were selected for phone interviews. And those phone interviews included congregational leaders, but also included young adults, no teens at that point, only young adults. Out of that 41, then 12 were selected for in-person visits. And those on-site visits then also included conversation with teens as well as young adults. And part of that was they were wanting to be really cautious about young people being interviewed, teenagers needing to have sort of some parental understanding of what the parameters were around the study, and also that the young people would have a better understanding of that as well. Over the course of all of that process, they ended up with 10,000 pages of transcripted notes, which they turned over to their doctoral students under supervision, of course, and they began looking for common threads. So, you know, what is it that seems to be common to these congregations of very different sizes, very different denominational realities? Half of the congregations that were studied were not primarily Caucasian, which is very interesting in the context of church life in the United States at this point. And out of that 10,000 pages of notes came these 6 core commitments. Really with the understanding that these are really good beginning points. These were not exhaustive. There are other things that could have been suggested, but these seemed to be the 6 that would lead congregations, lead parishes into some really critical conversations and some perhaps shift in practice that would lead to the kind of culture shift that is being suggested. Let me stop there because I've talked already a whole long time. I'm wondering, Jonathan, what are you thinking and how have you been thinking about this?
No, I think it's so helpful to have a bit of a context. I mean, and helpful probably to know that the book identifies that 6% of the overall churches talked to are Catholic. And so it's not necessarily heavy in that Catholic population, but I think I find it very, very helpful and very common. I think this, you know, one of the blessings and challenges, I think, is we're in a season of church life where there's a lot of sociological data coming out. And that I know I've had conversations with other pastoral leaders that we could spend, you know, a full day or 2 days a week just reading the latest from Pew or what's been pouring back over things from NSYR or looking at this or what Barna's done. I mean, and yet alone Going, Gone from St. Mary's Press just having come out, or all the work Kara does. So there is a bit of an overload mentality, I think, in terms of what's there. And so this is why I'm so grateful for just the ability to have a conversation, because it just helps to distill what we're hearing. But also I think to be, what I appreciate about Growing Young is it does begin to tie some dots together. So you see Christian Smith's work sewn through this a little bit. And I think as many of us have begun reading more of what Going, Gone talks about with a bit of a younger demographic, only going up to 25 in that study, and focusing on those who have left, it's really refreshing, and I think in some senses maybe more helpful or easier to talk with pastors about what is working in terms of a positive path forward instead of a way of negation. And in fact, much of disaffiliation conversations are really pointing to what they wish they would have had, which I think this helpfully shows us. So one of the things I like about this wheel is they talk about, you know, and laid out in the book, beginning with keychain leadership is the most common path. of this process of developing and implementing core commitments. But as you said, the ring of context being the number one sort of hermeneutic to understand that, but that also for different communities, these stepping stones, if you will, can be placed in different ways, but that also as a red flag, what doesn't work is cherry picking, which I thought was a really helpful comment, because I think in our pastoral life, there's so much going on, especially in parishes, that say, oh, we'll try to do this one thing and see if that works. Well, that, individual programs or efforts don't work. To your point, we're really about converting hearts and converting culture in church life that I'm hopeful with the attention given by the Holy Father this year in preparation for the Synod, and then following the Synod with presumably a post-apostolic exhortation, will have a bit more attention, not to run to the next program or effort that a national organization or religious community puts out, but rather a process by which we can really do the internal work that needs to be done, that's required to do the kind of evangelization that Francis is calling for in Evangelii Gaudium. And so this it seems to be situated really nicely in between a focus on the family and Amoris Laetitia that was raised, and pointing us to the Synod in October in terms of focusing on young people. And I love the line, if you can reach a 20-year-old, you can reach a 60-year-old. But maybe from my perspective, the challenge or the fallacy, the myth in our Catholic community, I would maybe propose, is that we think if you reach a 10-year-old, you reach a 60-year-old. And we're seeing that's not true. That a religious education classroom model of catechesis outside of those sticky relationships and context of knownness, that doesn't work. And I think we've borne the weight of that as we see that disaffiliation having grown up. And so I'm really excited for us to maybe just briefly talk about what does work and what we've seen. So let's sort of just briefly touch, if you would, Lisa, on some of the high points of these different core commitments. And I'll maybe add one or two notes that I took. Again, if you have something to share on the phone or on the line, I see there are about 10 of us in this little small group conversation, please feel free to type those and make sure you click to everyone. That way we can all see sort of your thoughts on that. But certainly then, as we quickly move through these, we'll then open up conversation to see what sort of bubbled to the top in this conversation that stuck out to you, or that you've read and wanted to discuss as well. So with that, why don't you talk a little bit about keychain leadership and how we unlock that as maybe a common beginning point?
Yes, and let me just back up just for a half a second. A couple of interesting things, Jonathan, about what you just said. One is the folks at Fuller said that from the outset they were determined to look at essentially what's working or what is helping in a variety of situations, which I also am very drawn to. The other thing I find helpful at this juncture is just to know that one of the things that they did do was to reach out to Christian Smith and asked him to look at this, and he found it to be helpful as well. And I think that's important because so many of us have been steeped in his research and his understanding for so long. So with that, keychain leadership, while they will say that really we can plug ourselves in anywhere along that circle, they will say that the leadership piece is essential. And they coined the phrase keychain leadership by way of one of the people that's on their team who talked about, as a teenager, getting his driver's license, driving to church, and walking onto church grounds, and the person who was directing the preschool program said, oh my goodness, you have a car, that means you might be able to come in the afternoon, would you be willing to work with us in the preschool in the afternoon after school? And she gave him a key. And that recognition that she was giving him a key changed everything for him. That suddenly he saw himself being included in what had up until that time been a very adult circle. And so the idea of keychain leadership really is about meaningful leadership, meaningful involvement, and really listening to young people when they're ready to offer their ideas and when they're ready to jump in. And I find probably just as challenging as the notion of drawing people into leadership, walking alongside them. So we're not throwing the keys at them. We're not, kind of turning it over to them and saying, it's yours, I'm done. But rather, how do we really partner with young people so that they can take their meaningful place within the community of faith?
Yeah, and what strikes me about this step is just how basic it is at one level. They talk about the importance of just knowing people's names, and one of my sort of recognitions in ordinary common parish life, certainly not every parish, is just that we're not built for relationships of knownness to facilitate what used to be quite ordinary. Because people went to church in their same neighborhood, they knew their neighbors, they knew father for generations, their extended family was close by, families didn't get divorced, they stayed together, people got involved in community groups and associations. All of those, as Robert Putnam talks about broad social disengagement, it's all gone. And as a result, we have to have more intentional processes of facilitating this leadership. It really strikes out to me as to a word they talk about later, of the word of mentorship. Of how do we create relationships of mentoring or mentorship? Some Catholic groups will talk about discipleship and use that sort of phrase. Others will talk about Christian friendship or spiritual companionship. To me, we're hitting at really common or shared functions of accompaniment, as in the language of Francis, right? To help people sort of stand on their own 2 feet, to live into that reality. And I love the image of like beginning to drive a car. It's not just getting in the seat, it's adjusting the mirrors and the seats. And sometimes we have a lot of people in our church screaming to not move the mirror an inch. And I think that's really helpful for us to be attentive to when we talk about that culture. But yeah, to your point, to help give young people a seat at the table. And one of the things I'd like to share in these conversations we have is what we heard from young people directly when we did our synod listening process just over a year ago in preparation for our diocesan listening that every diocese was asked to do, preparing for this fall synod. And one of the things we heard of our sort of 6 key themes, one of them was we want a seat at the table. We want opportunities for leadership. We're especially talking about millennials, of which this study is primarily focused, we're the Facebook, Twitter, Instagram generation. Not that we use it, we created it. Right. Let's give a little bit of credence to what young people can do, but that requires innovation, that requires time, and oftentimes that's time that our pastors or parish leaders just don't have, operating out of such a deficit mentality.
Right.
So the second day I did, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I noticed the Anthony's comment about the practical suggestions. I think there are so many things in the book that really provide us with just that food for thought, and I found, I actually had the opportunity to sit at table with a team from a Baptist church in North Carolina, and they let me be part of their conversations this past week as they were really beginning to draw out their plan. And they were talking about some of these very practical things that they actually went to the teens and young adults that are already involved. And they said, okay, so what ideas do you have? And they actually were in a situation where 2 of their congregation members had passed away last year and had bequeathed money for mission outreach. And so they had decided, it's really easy to just throw money at a national group or an international group, but instead, what could the young people suggest to do some things right there in their local community? And talk about key chain leadership. Then they had to get into those conversations about what does that mean for us? How much mentoring do they need? How much freedom can we give and yet ensure that not only is the project going to go well, but that these young people are going to have good experiences so that they'll want to do more? And those are the kinds of questions that we get into. And I think just having these conversations are really crucial to the kind of culture change that we're talking about. That really leads to the next core commitment. And what I'm finding, the more I've paid attention to what's happening in the training with the various groups that are going through it right now, is these 2 first steps really kind of drive everything else. The whole idea of having empathy for young people, it's so easy to say, if they would only do, you know, if they would, if they blah, blah, blah. And to really try to put ourselves in that perspective of accompaniment, of mentoring, of walking with, alongside. And one of the things that really strikes me, and I guess part of this is just my counseling background, but you know, the whole idea of those primary tasks of identity, belonging, and purpose, and how, you know, what those really are universal themes in personal development that we all go through constantly throughout our lives, but of course, particularly at this age time. And what does that look like? You know, how do we help young people to really answer or deal with some of those primary questions of who am I? You know, and do I belong here? And as I'm reading Going, Going, Gone, I'm just reading it now, you know, but it's all over the place there, you know. Do I belong here? Is this really my tribe? You know, and what does that mean in my life? And what does that have to do with the greater meaning for me in my life and purpose?
Yeah. There's a wonderful new off-Broadway musical called, I believe it's called Being Evan Hansen, that is like quintessentially millennial. It's really good music, but one of the most popular songs is called Looking Through a Window. And the beginning line of that, it says, I learned to slam on the brakes before I even turned the key, before I made a mistake, before I lead with the worst of me. This is the millennial take of like, I've seen a generation before me get divorced at rapid rates. I've experienced this parenting of hovering and of 9/11 and of terrorism, and grown up in this culture where I don't want to make the wrong decision. I want to stay in. I'm going to self-medicate. And so we know, well, no wonder we see rises in pornography, in opioid addiction, in violence. I mean, one of the things with young adult ministry we don't talk enough about is the fact that those, you know, school shootings affect young people, but school shootings are often affected by young people. So what are the realities of depression and violence that are a part of people's everyday experience? And I love in that section on empathizing with young people, this reality of delayed adulthood that I just don't think older generations have fully understood, because it was just so different one or two generations prior. People don't get married at 23 or 24 now. The average age of marriage in Maryland is 29 and in DC is 30. And I love how they articulate not only is the race ending later in life, but it's beginning earlier. And so with access to information, which ties into a lot of what the Barna research talks about there in terms of how that access to information shapes us into a new way of thinking. They were overstimulated but under-supported. And that when you think about it, young people really need and benefit from counseling services, mentorship that exists, or coaching that exists in the high school and the collegiate period of life, fraternity and sorority life, et cetera. And as soon as they hit 21, everything disappears. In the most meaningful, as Meg Jay would say, the defining decade of people's life. And I think we as a church are a bit complicit in that reality, recognizing that we have a bit of an adolescent focus of catechesis and ministry instead of an adult focus, especially for those in key areas of discernment.
Yeah. Well, and I noticed Amberly and Anthony both mentioned the 25 is the new 15 and 15 is the new 20. You know, I've been thinking back to my days as a parish faith formation director, and I actually had a faith formation commission that included people of all ages, and I specifically asked 2 teens and 2 young adults to be part of the commission, and part of their agreement was that they would at least be able to tag team. So knowing young adult life, you know, you're never going to always be able to be there, but between the 2 of them, they would always try to have one present. And I always remember an evening when Molly, who at the time was, I think, 17 or 18, said, you know, guys, all well and good, everything that we've been talking about, but if you really think that this is the way it happens, I got news for you, you know. And her insight was, you know, catechesis in the parish is fine up to about grade 6. And think about this in terms of going, gone, and a lot of the 13. Other things that we've heard. Yeah, 13. But once young people start asking adult questions, all of a sudden there's crickets on the other side. You know, none of the adults want to deal with this. And so how do we, you know, come at this from the standpoint of really wanting to be with, rather than kind of just shooting out all this wonderful information and expecting people to take it at face value and going, oh yeah, I'm right there.
Yeah, and to your point about adult questions, I think that leads us into the next sort of chain in the process of taking Jesus' message seriously. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. First of all, they say they specifically put Jesus-centered community in the middle because that really is what all of this is about. But yet they did feel like there had to be this specific look at this as a core commitment, and that focus on the gospel. And the depth of the gospel. This is not about dumbing down. This is not about watering down, which I think is really crucial. I've been reflecting on this just in terms of, we are very blessed that with the lectionary, our people, if they're coming to Mass, our people hear a good chunk of the gospel every year. My question is, as we teach, the depth of everything that we have within the deposit of faith, do we effectively link it back to Jesus, to the gospel, to sacred scripture, do we help young people to make those connections with their daily lives, and as I've just had early conversations with people about this, I keep saying, as catechetical leaders, we've been saying this for years. How do we help people make those primary connections between Sunday and, I love David Kinnaman at Barna said they need, younger adults need bridges between Monday to Friday and Sunday. And I keep saying, well, don't we all, But I do think that we've got some real opportunity there within our Catholic life to really help people to make some primary connections.
And I think this has been one of the really positive influences of Catholic evangelization focus or catechesis in the United States in the last decade is a real renewed focus on the kerygma and an understanding that we have to proclaim and help people to understand at a basic level and at an integrated personal level how God's working. And this reflects a lot of what Sherry Waddell talks about in Forming Intentional Disciples. We have to ask people, tell me the story of God working in your life to this point, and not accept labels for stories, but really just take the time to ask the question and to listen. I know in the Archdiocese of Washington and D.C., we've had some successes with parish communities or ministry events, reintroducing the witness talks, which is very much more common in Protestant communities, but the reality of our ritual prayer in the Eucharist and our Sunday experience, while is morally sufficient for Catholic life, I think we're seeing it's no longer sociologically sufficient. Because of the weakened connections that we find. And so to Kinnaman's point, we do have to build those bridges. And so there's certain ways you can appropriately, I think, build some of that in, either before or after liturgy or within the liturgy itself. But often I think we're talking about networks of relationship and belonging, starting in the family life, that really takes that message of Jesus seriously. And I love how the book talks about, people keep looking at young people, older generations isolate with young people and talk about this moralistic therapeutic deism or this lack of commitment and faith. And the reality is both Christian Smith and this study says they're simply reflecting what they've been told or that's either been taught or caught at home. And I think that puts the onus more on older generations as well as our own to really talk about that thin gospel that they talk about, that we have to repropose a rich understanding that, again, to your point, Lisa, is within our Catholic theology. When we talk about a liturgical worldview, the liturgy of life, the Our Father, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. That's what this book is talking about, helping people to reclaim that and to do the hard work that goes into that, not the easy way out. There's a great book a decade or so ago called Do Hard Things on ministry with young people. We have to call people to do hard things, and often people raise to that standard when we do.
Right. And I love Brian's insight here that it's an announcement, but it's also an invitation and a response.
Beautiful.
In faith and conversion. And, I've for the last number of years, I've been talking with people about, the ways in which we as people in our faith communities can build bridges to others. And I share with them, that one of the big takeaways for me in Christian Smith's work is this idea that, our young people need to have experience or need to know people who have had experience of the miraculous. In other words, how is God working in our lives? And as Catholics, we've not been good at those kinds of conversations. but we need to be, our young
break that
people,
silence.
Yeah, and I my husband is a 7th grade catechist, and so he has these conversations with, young adolescents all the time about, if the young person at home says, why do we believe this, and the parent goes, I don't know, where does that get us, and so how do we begin to develop a culture that says these kinds of conversations not only are important, but they're crucial, And really,
Absolutely.
that leads to the next thing about warm relationships. Warm is the new cool. Really, if I were to, and it's interesting because at the training last week they were telling people that if we've ramped up the kind of heat on leaders through these first 3, which we have, if we really start working with this, the heat just keeps getting ramped up. Then we get to warm relationships, and we can all kind of take a step back for a second and go, okay, now we're all right again, because that is something that we tend to at least value. We may not do it particularly well, but at least we value it. And so it is a place where we have some things that we can do, that we can build on, that we can learn from. There are some easy on-ramps when we start talking about warm relationships. But yet, those of us that have read the book, when we think about the kind of warm relationships that they're talking about, where young people are known, where they will be missed if they're gone. I love the principle that actually came from Sticky Faith of, instead of a 1-to-5 ratio, looking at a 5-to-1, and actually in our case it's probably more like a 1-to-500 in some ways, and
right?
I keep thinking about a campaign in a parish that simply said, who's your 5? Or are you part of someone's 5? And what a difference that in and of itself could make, irrespective of all the other things that are here, what a difference that would make in the life of young people if they really knew that they had at least 5 people that were surrounding them.
Yeah, and I think you're right at this point. I think we're at a 1 to 500 ratio. When in our synod listening process, a word that came up over and over and over again was the word home. I want the church to be a place of home. And so when you break open all those sort of, all the meaning behind that word, a home is not just a building, right? It's a place of warmth, of welcome and hospitality, of belonging. It's a place you share meal, where you cry, where you rest. I think people are looking for that sense of home when we talk about warmed communities. But the reality is, again, the Sunday experience of church is liturgical and ritualized. It doesn't build, sociologically, it doesn't build relationships. And so, in the book, they talk about small group programs or small group ministries pretty quickly, because it's sort of assumed that every Protestant church is doing small group ministry. Well, goodness, do we have some catching up to do. And I think we can learn from what the Protestant communities have in the last 10 or 20 years to not just start a small group program and call that sufficient, but look at all the ways that our parish community can cultivate relationships of knownness. And when you look around parish life, we have those small, warm communities in lots of ways. The choir can be that small group. Parish council can be that small group. The Eucharistic ministers who gather before Mass can be that small group. We can sharpen the intentionality that help people be known. But as Going Gone said, one of the major signs of inauthenticity or distrust from churches was, I stopped going and no one noticed I was gone.
Right.
And I think we're real complicit in building these really, really large mega churches or suburban type parishes where we maybe welcome someone the first time they come, but we don't just have the process or the relational ties, the network built to continue to walk with people. And the same is true with RCIA. We see that people experience a real warm experience of growing in faith with a mentor in a small group in the RCIA, and as soon as they become fully initiated, we drop them. We walk people to the precipice of experiences, not through those experiences in a rich sense of mystagogy. And I think that's an area that we can learn from in terms of what they talk about. We asked young people in our synod listening, do you have a friend at your parish? And over 50% of youth and over 50% of young adults said no.
No.
We asked the same question, do you have an older adult who's a mentor to you? And the same, it was about 50% who said no. And most people who filled out our survey went to Mass every week, and a third of them went to daily Mass. So we're talking about the most Catholic, most involved, most engaged young adults, and they're lonely. They're ecclesially lonely. And I think that's an opportunity for us to really think practically about how we facilitate warmth. because the 20 people most involved in the church think their community's warm because they have the same 20 people they know. But to have that physical
unfortunately, those 20 may just be creating an environment in which everybody else feels like they're outside, you know, which really this invites us to have some critical thought about. It's important then to notice that when we get to that prioritizing everywhere, this is the place where if we do not do this, the parish becomes old. You know, and we hear lots of parish leaders saying, we're graying, we're dying out, we're getting smaller, and that kind of creates an ongoing culture that, you know, reinforces itself, unfortunately. One of the things that I love that the Fuller folks found in their study is giving young people a larger piece of the pie doesn't mean that everyone else gets a smaller piece. That everyone rises is their phrase, and I love that. And that actually was my own personal experience in the parish where I was. The more we engaged young people, our median age was dropping, the parish was growing, because there's something very compelling about life, faith that's being lived in these very profound ways in people of all ages, and that interaction among the generations really is very healthy and leads us to a different way of being disciples together. And so that prioritization, one of the things that I think is extremely helpful for us at this stage is to realize that that doesn't always mean money. I think we here prioritize and we immediately go, oh my gosh, that means, you know, we're going to have to take money from somewhere else in order to. I think, again, when we come back to the idea of key chain leadership, you know, having empathy, those warm relationships, it's that kind of priority that we're really talking about. It may eventually mean that we've got to look at budget and all of those other things, but that's not the only way that we prioritize. And I think that's really helpful for us to be keeping in mind.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I love in the book how they talked about how action trumps intentionality, which trumps importance. So I think we have to begin to walk that road to make the cultural claim that this is important to us, and then to do the work of making that intentional across every sphere of Catholic parish life, and then to discern together what that action is. I believe that while the first step shouldn't be money or hiring, I think in general in the American landscape of church life, as Christian Smith notes, one of the reasons why Catholic young people leave at a faster rate than Protestant young people is because we invest less in ministry with them. So I think that's probably a part of the conversation, but Lisa, I love your intuition that that's not the place to start, certainly not in the planning process in trying to win over pastors. But to really begin with the process of our budgets are moral documents, and can we begin the conversations there? Especially around doing things the right way. You know, Lisa, you have done a lot of work, obviously, with engagement and strengths, and the book Growing an Engaged Church, and this just jumped out to me in this section. This idea of belonging leads to believing, leads to behaving leads to believing. That we first have to facilitate relationships and communities of belonging on the path to lifelong practice of faith, and that we're just not there. But that at the end of the day, I think some of the things we've learned in the Archdiocese of Washington, or that I've learned, is that programs are great, and you can find the right program that should work and fit, but culture trumps programs 10 times out of 10. Yep. And so we're beginning to do a bit more of the slower work of culture change or culture discernment within our parishes about where young people are. You know, about 40% of the city of Washington is under the age of 40, or is between, 18 and 39. So this isn't just a small piece of community. This is the majority in some of our parishes of the population, like St. John's and Indy, and that we're trying to discern how we bring about that shared expectations to sharpen the intentionality and lead to some discernible action.
Yeah, and that really is a great lead into the sixth core commitment, which is the one about being best neighbors. And again, we have a lot of potential there. It's simply that we already, our parishes have a lot of social outreach, ministry to the local community, the national community, and beyond. I think the real challenge there for us, and this is not where I would lead from, if I was going to talk with a pastor, this would kind of really be the last thing, is just that idea of who's on the margins. And that is so important for our young people. They're extremely attuned to exclusion, and there's a whole lot of life around us that feels exclusionary to young people, but that's not the place I think we start the conversation, just because I think if there are other things that can help us, especially when we come to empathy. There are lots of ways to kind of get at this one. And the reality is, you know, if we are serving side by side, we're building some of those relationships, and then we have the opportunity to draw people into that deeper understanding of what we believe and how we live it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We can't begin with going out. We have to begin with, you know, sort of doing the internal work, because at the end of the day, what are we inviting people into? We always need to have a missionary impulse, but I think it's recognizing that in some ways, the peripheries that we have to begin with is the human heart, and the periphery is the silence that exists in our parishes of friendship and community, right? And that we have to shatter that before we can go out and welcome people into it. Again, one of the things that, to your point, that young people said in our synod listening is that they want a church that goes out, that's present in the community, that's at the block parties and the fairs and the festivals, that's engaged in daily and public life, because they're engaged in daily and public life, and they don't see this bifurcation between faith and life, which is a really, really good thing. But it does mean we're in a period of the church where we can't just stay inside the church and wait for people to come. And one of my former pastors used to say, you know, parish boundaries used to tell people where to go to church, but now they really tell the church where to go to people. And I think answering the question, do our churches look like our coffee shops? Are we really enculturating the gospel message to the people of God placed within our parish boundaries? And I think that's that sense of neighborliness, which can start by simply helping people be good neighbors. You know, I'm complicit in not knowing my neighbors very well where I live. And there are a lot of fair reasons for that in terms of mobility and busyness. But I think at the end of the day, we have to revive a sense of neighborliness within our human communities, but especially within our spiritual communities now.
Yeah. And I love Anthony's insight here. You know, why should people serve in the church versus the many successful secular institutions? How are we different? We have Jesus, you know. And that radical recognition of dignity, that's huge for us, you know. And it's one of the, you know, as I talk a lot with people about stewardship. And really the beginning of stewardship is that recognition that we're all created in God's image, you know, and that each of us is called to holiness. And when I talk with people about that, there's this almost this rush of relief that this is my place, you know, and that they do have something to contribute. And I think that we have a lot of potential to reach our young people through that deep recognition of who we are as God's people. Let me just real quickly, because I'm looking at time, and I hope that we're going to be able to open this up to now a wider conversation. I just want to let people know, Jonathan's got my contact information. If you want to, you know, kind of bat this around, or maybe we find a way to regather a few months down the road or whatever. But, you know, I'm certainly up for an ongoing conversation about all of this. And I now am fully trained, for what that's worth. But that means that, you know, I am actually going to do a deep dive workshop at the NCCYM in December. But that's, you know, a long way away, and that's with a particular segment of our ministerial leadership group. So now what do we, oh, and there's Jonathan's given you my email address there. You know, in a little bit of time, I'll be creating a section on my website specifically on Growing Young. I'm not there yet, but it's coming. But do reach out if there's anything that you'd like to explore.
And at this point, everyone should be unmuted or just about to be unmuted. So if you have a question, you should be able to just speak freely, and the screen will pop to you. So if you have a question or want to make a comment on something that stuck out to you in these next 10 minutes, I think we have to end right at 2:30, but we can certainly continue conversations moving forward as well.
Sure, I'll bring up a question. Earlier, I think can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Earlier, I had, I think, shot a comment up when we were talking about the empathizing section. and I was kind of wondering your guys' thoughts on the relationship between maturity, because that was kind of a theme of how early does that process of youth and growing up start, and continue the complexity there. So of our perception of a young person's maturity, the expectations we place on them, because it also talked about how much we expect of them in terms of the progressive sports and academics and things, and then the responsibility and respect we give them, because it seems like sometimes those can be inverted, right? We have these huge expectations in some areas, but then a real fear of giving them those keys, as mentioned in the first chapter. So I wonder if you guys have any insight on that.
My gut says it's going to be that really delicate dance, and it's going to be a little bit different in every young person's life. I know in my ministry at the parish level, there were some young people who really were ready to make that deep dive commitment to lead in some meaningful way, and there were others that were really trying to navigate, where does this fit in the grander scheme of the rest of my life, and I never found an easy answer. I don't know if anybody else has. If you have, I'd love to hear.
Well, I do love the suggestion, one of the practical suggestions they give later, which I think could help us begin to try to unpack that as a Catholic community, as a ratio question. I love the idea that we should have more adults to every one person.
Yeah.
Lisa, this might strike a chord with you, but it made me think of how case management and treatment team works. I used to work for a youth crisis center, and we would have a whole holistic team of people between parents and case managers and therapists, and so we would do that in secular ways to support people through crisis, but how are we all getting together as a leadership team and not only asking about programmatic concerns, but asking about individual kids and young people, how are our relationships going, what are the things that people need, and really delving into those personal issues. So I really like that idea of massing around people, but I think parishes struggle with gathering that qualified leadership and volunteers, and I don't want to belittle that challenge, because that's a huge challenge. Yeah.
And I think those are some of the conversations that are, especially at the parish level, but also within our diocesan teams. I think we need to be looking at how do we, I keep thinking about the idea of accompaniment and mentoring, which are, so kind of closely aligned, but how do we somehow form adults when they're ready to have those kinds of meaningful relationships with young people, and actually even with each other. Again, our ritual sacramental life has not always led to the kind of relationships and interrelationships that we're talking about here. And I think, from the adult perspective, many adults feel ill-equipped. And so how do we equip our people just to enter into relationship and not feel afraid to talk about their faith?
Well, and I think it speaks to, Lisa, am I too loud there? I saw you jump.
You're good.
I think it speaks to this idea that we need to look at mentoring and companioning and accompanying as part of that whole culture change. There's not one person that's responsible for that. There's not a paid, it's not just paid staff. It's not just diocesan staff. It's looking and saying, we are a whole Christian Catholic community. There may be someone at in one of the local religious orders, or someone at another parish or another nonprofit that might be able to companion this person or this group of people in a way. We just have to figure out how to get to that place so that we know and can tailor that, because we don't have to exist within the walls of our parishes or within the boundaries of our dioceses either. And I think there's a piece to that too with our young people. They don't know boundaries. They know constant, instant access to everybody and everything. So
yeah.
And again, I'm not proposing I know how we would make that happen, but are there ways that we can get at their interests and where they're at different places on that spiritual spectrum, and then connect them to those people who can help mentor them and move them forward in that way, so that we're not the only ones holding the keys.
Right. Right.
That's a great point, Amberly. One of the things that continues to strike me that I keep going back to, and I've mentioned it once before, is that book, Growing an Engaged Church, that when we just look around at the human capital that we have in our parishes right now, I think we have to just be really honest that we don't have the relational infrastructure of engaged folks, people who are committed to their community, who have an emotional connection, who have a friend at their church, are excited to be inviting people. That's just not the culture of people. So we do need to be re-evangelizing the people of God by engaging them in leadership and in the life of the community. That's why I love that idea, not just that belonging leads to believing, but that belonging leads to behaving, which leads to believing, that it's in the doing the work of, and which is so true of the Catholic Church, right? The RCIA works like that. In the community of belonging, you begin to do the rituals, and it's in the rituals that you lead to eventually belong in some real meaningful way. I'd say we have to also, in the process of engagement and discernment, which is why I think the Synod is going to be so exciting, help people to discern their vocation, not just sacramental vocation, but their vocation to love in the world and the gifts that God has given them. So we've used Living Your Strengths and need to do more of that. We also developed, with the Catholic Apostolate Center, a formation program for young adults called Apostles on Mission, which is a 10-week formation program in evangelization where they discern a personal sort of evangelization effort or project they're going to work on, and we pair them with a mentor. So just, I think apostolic formation has to be a part of it, to be missioning people on a regular basis, including older adults. And so we're even looking now, to your point, Amberly, of we're past the point where you can hire a youth minister or young adult minister to run a youth group or a young adult group, but rather one that trains trainers, that mentors mentors. It's probably language we need to use more of. And we're just not there yet, but I think we're going to begin doing some mentor training to start with those who are most involved, that the choir director, the Eucharistic minister, scheduler, the parish staff, those people really need to be mentors first. And that's where the culture change needs to happen. So we're gonna begin those conversations, and if people are already doing things in that area, I'd love to learn more about it.
Well, and especially because we have so many things that are common to parish life already that have a lot of potential for relationship building, and I'm thinking about the summer mission trips and the confirmation groups and all on and on and on and on. But we tend to look at those in isolation, and we tend to look at those as one-off things rather than realizing that relationships are being built there, and how do we establish that culture that says those relationships are really vital and need to continue. And then how do we help that to happen organically, but with some guidance, and those are the kinds of things that I've been asking myself, even in the lives of my own 2 young adult children, as I've watched them navigate that move into different life away from home and all of that, and the way in which they're just looking for connections that can last.
Right. I'm curious if anyone else has any sort of parting comments. I know we're just about up at 2:30, so probably not a lot more time right now for discussion, but I hope we can continue this in some way, and certainly would love to see the resources or efforts that different dioceses and parishes are working on. But any sort of final comments on our time from our participants?
Just one more thing that I'd love to share real fast is that the Fuller people actually just said to people at the end of the first training, go out and experiment. And I love that.
Yeah.
There is no one size, and so just go out and try something, and then let everybody know what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to point back to a comment that Jonathan made earlier about because this has been a topic of his and I conversations at work about anything can be a small group in a parish, because if we look at how do we form and build that human capital in our parishes, I think it's looking back to what the USCCB talks about in the process of evangelization. How are we building intentional community before sending those people out? And so I think there's really practical ways for us to go into a parish, look at the structures where people are already meeting and already forming some pieces and components of community, and helping them to be more prayerful, more intentional, more relational, and then giving them that piece that says, now go out and do that more in your everyday life, in your workplace, and outside of the parish.
Thank you so much
Absolutely.
for that. And you know, I'm also seeing Brian's comment here that, you know, when all is said and done, we're never going to be finished with this, you know, and it is just this kind of constant assessment, which Anthony, you just kind of spoke to as well. You know, we already have been having these conversations. I think this gives us a way to perhaps focus our attention in some very particular ways in the recognition that probably anything that we do along the lines of any of these 6 core commitments is going to have a positive impact, and what a gift that is. And there's, you know what, if I wonder, Jonathan, could we send out a real quick email with the other email addresses so that people can stay in touch?
Sure. If people want to type their email in, I'm happy to share for those who would like to. I'm happy to sort of kick off that conversation if people want to share ideas from here on out. And I saw someone comment about continued conversations like this. I might let, you know, the Catholic Apostolate Center follow back up, or I saw someone mention NCCL, so I certainly would talk to them because they do some wonderful collaborative dialogues, I know.
Yeah. And the other thing that I'm trying to remember to do as I'm talking with people about this, and, you know, that's going to become much more of my ministry in the coming weeks and months, is I'm trying to remember to use the hashtag Catholics Growing Young on both Facebook and Twitter. And so if you connect to me there, you can kind of be attuned to the other people that are having these same conversations.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, everyone. And thank you, Lisa, for taking the time.
Absolutely.
It's such a privilege just to talk with you and learn a little bit more about this study. Hopefully we can continue to share that in our local parishes and dioceses.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Jonathan, for putting this all together.
And thanks finally to the Catholic Apostolate Center for hosting us here. You can learn more about them at CatholicApostolatecenter.org and the Apostles on Mission program at apostlesonmission.org. So have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much.
Great. Take good care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.